Welcome today. It's good to see some visitors with us today. Trust that you've had a nice 4th and gathering, and there's some that are probably still camping today, so it looks like. But that's what summer is all about. We go when we can and gather here. This is a kind of an unusual scenario here. The very first Sunday that we come back after the coronavirus was the biggest Sunday that we've had, but then we went down and then back up again somewhat, and then camping kicked in, and they opened up some of the places where they could camp. So here we are, and God will work with us as much as possible. And if I find out that this is causing the attendance to go down, we may cut this off so that they have to come and hear word for word in person. So, but no, there's a lot of people that are getting the message through the online that can't come, and we want them to be able to be a part of it. So I don't think it's interfered at all. So you can run, but you can't hide, is what we're going to be kind of banging around here this morning a little bit. The text today is in Genesis chapter 42, verses 21 through 24. Let me read that for us here right now. Speaking among themselves, they said, "Clearly we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we are in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy?" Reuben asked. "But you wouldn't listen, and now we have to answer for his blood." Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been talking to them, speaking to them through an interpreter. Now he turned away from them and began to weep. And when he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. Then he chose Simeon from among them and had him tied up right before their eyes. We are continuing our time here with the story of Joseph, and today we're looking at Joseph meeting his brothers for the first time and being able to recognize them and have that is a very big deal. Even movies and plays have had this scene when they got together for the first time after they've been, it was over 20 years since their brothers had grabbed Joseph, thrown him in the pit, and then sold him to the Midianite travelers there, the traders, and was sent to Egypt. So here we are years later, and we see what God is doing here in this famine that they just found themselves up against. Time heals all wounds, or does it? Time can ease some of our thinking. Sometimes it's better to have a period of time between what happens to us and a fix for that down the road to make it a little easier. I have been, as a father, kind of upset sometimes with what the kids did, and found myself waiting for about 2 days before I dished out the punishment or the plan to correct what was going on. I might have not have dealt with it good the first immediately. Might have done things that was more selfish and not thinking so much about the total picture, and so we do that. What are some of the things that may not heal very good? These are some things that I have thought about. A divorce. These things don't go away. There are things that we carry with us for a long time. Those are some. Death of a child, a spouse. Death can be something that that we would think, you know, and somebody's looking on to us might say, well, yeah, see, time heals all things. It's not that it heals it, it just puts a scab over it, and it helps us to a little bit with the time that we get used to our situation maybe, but I'm not sure that it's healed. Betrayal from a friend or a family member or just somebody, a coworker, can be devastating. It could completely ruin somebody's reputation, maybe end their job. There's a lot of things that can happen with betrayal. And we've seen obvious examples in the Bible of being, different ones being betrayed. And there's lasting effects of those kinds of things. So we don't just recover from those things and move on because a few years passed. Spreading lies, there are those out there that are jealous and have issues with us, and so they may just conjure up lies and spread them as truth. And those things are equally bad as well. When we think of all these things that I just mentioned, there is a tendency for us, a big tendency, a big temptation for us to get our little notepad out and start developing a list, a hit list, so to speak. Probably nobody in here has a list of people that you would rather not be around at reunions and different places. But we're looking at that today. This is some of the things that we find in this story of Joseph that was, to me, a very awesome story, and Joseph, a very amazing man that was following the Lord. Look at, after over 20 years has passed, we have Joseph's 10 older brothers. Joseph now, without their having any idea that he's even alive, much less the prime minister, so to speak, of Egypt. In charge of everything that could be done, Joseph had his hand in it. There was nobody that could come into the country, receive their distributing of their portion of the grain that was there available without Joseph seeing them. Now, I don't know. I kind of somehow think that as some of the other countries around Egypt started to funnel into Joseph for grain, that Joseph wondered, I wonder when my own home country is going to be represented, which he knew would probably be some of his brothers coming. And so I don't know whether he was doing that or not, but I'm sure he was not shocked when his brothers showed up here for grain. Now, the reading of the text today is that meat of that meeting. They didn't know Joseph was Joseph. They thought he was a leader in Egypt. He was dressed in all the Egyptian headdress and all the things there, and he didn't speak to them in his native tongue. He was speaking through an interpreter to those brothers of his. So they thought that this was just a gruff guy that was dishing out in leadership in Egypt. So they, after a few questions, they turned away from Joseph and began to talk amongst themselves. They didn't have a clue that Joseph could hear every word that they were saying and understanding it perfectly. And I could imagine the look on Joseph's face, or the feeling in his heart, when he started to realize that these guys still, after 20 years, remembered what they did to me. Joseph also, just right in this same thing, turned away, and the first thing that comes to Joseph's mind wasn't, I wonder how I'm going to make these brothers of mine, their lives just absolutely miserable. That was not what his thought was. His thought was God put in his head the thing that he remembered after all of these years was something that God had done for him when he was just a boy at the age of around 12. He remembered the dreams that he had in regards to the brothers as sheaves bowing down to him, and the dream of basically of where this is right now. Joseph recognized that God had set him up those many years before, and was now that fulfillment of what Joseph's dream meant was happening right now, with Joseph taking care of his family in this famine that was now very severe. At the time, they weren't that excited about his dream. They didn't like it when Joseph was sharing those things, and the father wasn't helping by giving him a coat of many colors and honoring him above all the rest of the family. But we see here that time has not healed this situation. And I'm going to tell you today that if we have those kinds of situations, getting away from it, and years pass, it's not going to heal it. It would only take some minor situation to trigger all that hurt and all that pain to bring it back. And that's what happened here for these brothers. They had had families of their own. They had children of their own by now. Even told their dad, Reuben told his dad that if we don't bring back, this was a little bit later in the story, if I don't bring back Benjamin, you can kill my 2 sons. So that you can see here that they have all moved on, but this went with them. They tried to run, but they couldn't hide. It only took a little meeting here with some heartache in their own life, much like what they had done to Joseph as far as some of the pressure that they were feeling. And isn't that what happens sometimes with our problems that we have, with some of these hurts that we thought was long gone? We didn't think we had a problem anymore with that person until something makes us confront that again. And then we realize that the cut now has been tore back open, and it's just as bad, if not worse, now. There has to be some work done. There has to be some conclusion and some repair when these things happen, or they just stay there dormant for a period of time until somebody picks the scab. And that's apparently is what has happened here. But I noticed here, for Joseph, something must have taken place over these 20 years that helped him to not make that list. He had many he could have wrote on that list, just from the story that we have before us. Certainly could have put his brothers on that list and never was be willing to forgive them, looking for that day when he could even in the score and get things right. Now, I think the brothers wish they would have had opportunity since that time, that day, that they could have confronted their brother, made it right, and took care of some things. But they didn't have that time, which we don't sometimes have time to do it either. We cannot correct everything that's been tore up. We can, however, though, take the right channel to be able to correct this problem in our life. With God, we can kind of correct it. That's what I'm talking about here with Joseph. Joseph could have had a list. He didn't. In the story that we read here, there's no evidence that Joseph had an issue. We never see him referring back to those days when he was captured and sold and turned into a slave and all that. The only evidence of that he ever mentioned was that what you did to me, God has turned into some good for my life. What you did was God's will, because I needed to be in this position, and the only way that I could see to get in this position was the channels that we took to get here. So he didn't blame his brothers. He said it was God's will that I went through all this problem to get to where I'm at today so that I can help you. And this was further into the story. This was down the road past this time. But Joseph did not, he wasn't looking for the opportunity to throw them in jail and have them beheaded or anything that he could have done. He had the authority. Pharaoh made it very clear that nothing is going to happen in all of Egypt that doesn't go through Joseph's hand. It was going to filter through him. He had total authority to do whatever he desired to do. And he did not exercise his authority to make life miserable for his brothers. We see here him playfully working with his brothers, though. We see in this story that he questioned them. He knew them, so he knew that they weren't spies coming into the land to look over the weak spots in Egypt. However, he 3 times during his talk with them, he said, "You are spies," and it got rough enough that the conversation, like I just read to you, and they kept looking back, and he says, "It's because of what we did to our brother Joseph that why God is getting even with us here today." And so that's how we see this unfolding. What we see in the brothers was actually a seared conscience. It was time that has put a scab over what they've done. That they were probably living weeks at a time or months where they didn't think about Joseph, where they didn't think about things were going fairly well for them, so they didn't look at it like we're being punished. And I'm guessing that until this famine, when they planted stuff and when their flocks and all that were probably doing well, and things were going pretty well for them until this famine hit. And they had to try to protect themselves from starvation by coming here to Joseph. In a seared conscience, there has to be 3 things that's going to have to take place so that we can heal up those wounds. The first of these things that activate and get us back on the track of mending and healing and getting this situation corrected of that seared conscience that the brothers had, the first step is admitting that they have sinned. Until this time in the story, I don't think any of them got together and they had a meeting and said, what we did was wrong and we ought to, it was sin. What we did was against our brother, it was against our father, it was against God, it was sin. Without that admitting, the problem's not going to solve itself. It is not going to change. If we don't admit that we have, and we're taking it out of the church even, let's just go into life, unless we admit the guilt or the responsibility for our part in the activity that caused somebody some pain or some situation that wasn't good, we're never going to correct it. It won't solve itself. It's just going to get seared over, and down the road it could pop up at some point again. And it could pop up multiple times again if we don't correct the problem along the way. So the first thing in this process of getting our conscience, a guilty conscience, straightened out is admitting to this. This can make us even physically sick. If we won't admit our part in something, that could hit us multiple times down the road, and the guilt could actually physically make us sick. Let's take a look at what happened to David with his sin against Bathsheba, or with Bathsheba. Psalms 32, 34, 3 and 4, it reads like this: "When I refused to confess my sin, my body wasted away, and I groaned all day long. Day and night your hand of discipline was heavy on me, and my strength evaporated like water in the summer heat." That is David expressing what he felt like before he turned his life over to the Lord again, and asked God to forgive him for the sin that he had committed against Bathsheba and her husband Uriah. It will do the same to us. It can destroy one's life if we just refuse to deal with guilt and recognize that. The second thing that I want us to take a look at in regards to activating that seared conscience is that it begins to develop a different perspective. When we have admitted our part in the problem, in the sin, once we took that first step, now we start to see perspective again, a different perspective different angle from what we had looked at before. Let's take a look at Genesis 42, verse 28. It says, "Look," he said to his brothers, "my money has been returned, and it's here in my sack." Then their hearts sunk. Trembling, they said to each other, "What has God done to us? What has God done to us?" When they came to Joseph, there wasn't anything of what has God done to us. They weren't bringing that up. They were going to leave it buried if possible. But when we admit guilt and we're in the midst of some heartache and some suffering here on our own, surely this is God's way of putting a hammer down on us for what we've done to Joseph. We have the food distributed. Simeon has been latched onto, tied up, thrown into jail, and the rest of them were hightailing it back to the Canaan land with some grain in their sack. They had money to pay for that. They give it to the whoever was distributing. And Joseph told them, when they leave, fill their sacks and put all of their money back into the sacks. Now, I'm not sure if Joseph thought ahead far enough to know that when they found the money, they would be really squirming. They would be just thinking, wow, we just left that mean guy in Egypt, and if I have to go back to him and tell him and they finds out that we've taken the money again, that was, and they didn't look at it like, wow, this is an awesome thing to have all of our grain and our money too. He looked at it like, oh no, what we've done to Joseph, God is certainly going to get us back. What has God done to us? See, they weren't looking to what God was doing in this whole process until now. Now that they have admitted guilt, now that was happening, now they start to see things from a little different perspective. They probably start to see things that they should have done, how they should have handled things, and here they are, nervous wreck, trembling, and it was because they thought God was punishing them. We cannot run. Here again, we can run, but we cannot hide. These brothers did some nasty things to Joseph. 20 years have passed, and lo and behold, it's caught up with them. There's two things in this that I want us to look at right here. Two things that we can't run from. The first one is God. We cannot run away from God. There is no way that can happen. And secondly, just as important almost, is that we can't run from ourselves. Wherever we go, we take us with us. Our thoughts, our feelings, all that goes with us. Wherever we go, they chase us like a shadow and catch up with us, and when we're sleeping or alone or whatever, they begin to work at us. So no matter what we do, those two things are going to make sure that there's no healing done on some of these guilty acts until we actually solve the problem. And the final thought on that, what happens when we are activated, or when we start to activate a seared conscience. When some of the same exact feelings happen to us, bad things happen to us that we have caused somebody else in the past, that can trip our memory of what we did. That's what happened. As soon as they recognized that this prime minister of Egypt was asking some pretty touchy questions that they couldn't prove, they begin to remember what they did to their brother. Detail. I think they could have put that into a movie or in a play themselves and played out that whole scene and would have had it almost perfectly in line with what really happened that day when Joseph was coming to them. They remembered the look on his face when he was pleading for his life, and they throwed him into the pit. They didn't listen. They didn't do it what he wanted. They could see that horror look on his face. I think that's the way we got people all through our world, not just in the United States, but all over the world, have done horrible things to people, watched them die maybe, took children away from them, did all kinds of nasty things, and the look that was on the parent's face or on the husband's face or whatever the circumstances were, that was burnt right into their heads, into their minds. They can relive that at any moment when something triggers it. And the final thing is here that we're talking about is that that's what happened here to Joseph's brothers. They have had a pretty smooth sailing, obviously, over the past 20 years. I'm sure they individually thought about Joseph many times, wondering if he was alive, wondering what happened to him, and then to feel that shame and that guilt of them being responsible for it and replaying some of this stuff. But here together, when they were all together, you can imagine them when Joseph's talking to them, saying that they're spies and they're here, and none of yous are going to leave this place except one of yous. I'm going to let one leave to tell the story, basically. You go back to your homeland and try to get this thing corrected. Joseph actually, over the period of 3 days, he put him in jail for 3 days. And when he did that, at the end of the 3 days, he came to him again, and somehow along the way, his plan changed just enough to keep only one. And that's where we see here with Simeon. He was going to throw him in jail, and they were going to stay there until they went and got their brother and brought him back. But they were sweating it out. And there all these bad memories come flashing back to them of the look on Joseph's face when they put him in the pit, and then when they let him be sold and head down the road. See, they hadn't solved the problem. There was no place that they'd ever asked God for forgiveness for that. They haven't made it corrected. They didn't solve that. Joseph, on the other hand, the reason that he didn't hold a grudge, the reason he didn't, that when he seen his brothers, the memories didn't come flashing back, and he remembered them laughing at him, and as he was being thrown into the pit, all the mean things that they did at that point, that wasn't what Joseph was thinking about over the last 20 years. God worked with Joseph. We see in the story of so far up and through here, every time Joseph found himself in one of these unfair situations, the scripture jumps right over and says, and God was with Joseph. Which also means, as we have talked about this in our studies and the different things, when the Bible says that God was with Joseph, that meant really that Joseph was very close to God. And because of that close connection to God, he protected him and he helped him. And not only did he keep him safe in these situations, but he'd done something in the head of Joseph that he didn't spend 20 years thinking about ways to get even with his brothers. If I ever get next to them scoundrels, I'll kill them. You know, he had the power to do it. What an opportunity Joseph had here in a worldly sense. He could have sent them away hungry, without any food, and they wouldn't have lived too long, or he could have said, go in, and then he could have set the word, and their heads are gone. He could have had them killed easily, but he did not. That was not his intent. You see, when he turned away from them, and he remembered what God had done for him, and he remembered, God reminded him of the dream that he had that was for their protection. I'm putting you in this place so that you can have the power, the means, everything that we have, so that you can take care of not only your brothers, but your your mother and father as well, and all of your people. By now there was a fairly large clan of people. I think when they came to Egypt, there was like 75 people, some 72 to 75 family members at this point. And Joseph now is responsible, because of God, to be able to take care of that whole family. And he did that very nicely. I want us to recognize here today the two ways that things can go. And actually we have a two-sided story here. In an introduction here, or in the conclusion, we have, I just share here, don't keep a list. Don't turn to revenge to get back. You are, and we've said this multiple times, I preached on this, whoever keeps revenge and seeks revenge is ruining their own life. There is no future in it. There is not the way, it is a human way, it is the way of the flesh for us to want to get even with somebody who has damaged our lives. Maybe done things that are unthinkable and unrepairable, like they did to Joseph. Only God can take that away from us. We can give it to him, and he can seek out what he wants to do with those that have unjustly treated us, and unfairly and horribly. Only God can do it. Joseph's life could have went from bad to really bad had he sat in the prison and wrote down a list of all the people, if I ever get out of this spot, are going to die. They're going to pay a price. They're going to pay for what they've done. They didn't do it. Joseph, we can see, and we know that that was not the case. When Joseph was in these bad situations, I can't imagine being Joseph, being sold on a slave block from once being a very free person and very favored person, and knew that his God was the only God in the universe, that he was close to him. What is this? He could have got mad at God and just went ballistic on God for doing what was right, and then ended up in this mess. Joseph was not, we see that he had a close relationship with God. So when he got himself into that mess in Egypt, when he was sold as a slave and he went to Potiphar's house, God was with him. Joseph was very close to God still. And so, just like cream rises to the top of milk, Joseph's life became very evident to the Potiphar that Joseph was a special individual. Whatever Joseph put his hands on in his work and in what he managed and everything that Joseph did, it turned to gold, more or less. He was almost like the Midas man. Whatever Joseph did, prospered, flourished. And so Potiphar was not he recognized that ability that was in Joseph. And so he put him in charge of everything. And then we know the story, and then we know he ended up in jail. He could have went nuts again, but he didn't. He just did what God, somehow Joseph knew that God was going to get him out of this mess, and he was going to survive, and it was going to be good. And so Joseph, whatever he did in the prison, first thing you know, the warden in the prison is putting Joseph in charge of all the people and all the things, the duties that need done in there, and everything was flourishing in the prison for the warden. Everything was working out for good. That wouldn't have happened. He would have probably still been a slave, if not dead, if he would have been making a list in the Potiphar's house, making a list of his brothers and Potiphar and all the ones that were treating him horribly. That's not what happened. He was still doing whatever God puts us to do. We need to do it as we're doing it unto the Lord. Somehow Joseph, against all odds, against all the misery and all the problems that he had suffered unjustly, he was able to work as he was working unto the Lord. Without anybody watching, he was doing his job and doing it well. And he was blessed by God to have wisdom to know how to do all these different things. he was being prepared, basically, for the day when he become the prime minister of Egypt. That he would do the work of being the prime minister in a fair and just way. And that's what he did. He didn't treat his brothers with disdain and want to kill them when they got inside of them. Only God can take away our desire to make a list. We have to pray. We have to trust that God can handle that job better than we can. And he can show us the wisdom of giving up that revenge so that we are not ruining our lives as we eat at our insides with guilt and with anger and rage for those that mistreated us along the way. Joseph was able to do that. How about you? Can we do that? Can we give God our list and let him take care of the list so that we can live, so that we can have that abundant life that he told us that we need to have? Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you right now thanking you for the wonderful privilege that we have of living for you, for study, for following you, and for every little thing that we need as the days go by, you can give it to us. Help us to lay aside all of our anger and rage that we might have against people that have just been horrible to us. You can handle that a lot better than we can. And so we just turn those ones over to you. Turn that list over to you so that we can have that abundant life that you told us that we will have. We thank you and praise you now in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.